Back then, it was still this kind of decision that if you were going to open a gallery, it was like becoming a monk, like take a vow of poverty. There really was no prospect of profit.
I'm Eileen Kinsella, and this is The Art Angle, a podcast from Artnet News where the art world meets the real world, bringing each week's biggest story down to earth. It has been 17 years since James Fuentes first opened a gallery under his own name. In the years since, he has carved out a unique position in the contemporary art world, representing an eclectic mix of older, sometimes overlooked artists alongside younger, buzzed-about names. Prior to that, he worked for a handful of high-profile gallerists, including Jeffrey Deitch, whose eye he first caught with an ambitious pitch for a reality television show about artists, an idea that was way ahead of its time, especially considering it was the early aughts. As a gallery owner, Fuentes has been a mainstay of the Lower East Side, which happens to be the same area where he grew up. Between his first smaller gallery on the appropriately named St. James Place and later at a larger location on Delancey Street, he has watched the shifts in the neighborhood, whether it was the micro-trends of galleries that flocked there and then left or kept shifting to different corners of the area. Amid all of the changes, he still regards the Lower East Side as a thriving and incredibly diverse place to live. Last year, James joined the ranks of East Coast dealers heading west to open a gallery in Los Angeles as the art scene there continues to evolve and grow. And just as he is set to mark the one-year anniversary on Melrose, another major change is happening, a big move across town in New York to Tribeca in a 3,000-square-foot ground floor space on White Street. I caught up with Fuentes to talk about growing up in New York City during the heyday of hip-hop and graffiti art. Fuentes also talked to me about his approach to the art business and the expansion of his own gallery business, alongside the broader growth and changes in the art world at large. Hi, James. Welcome to The Art Angle. It's nice to see you.
Nice to see you too.
So let's start at the beginning. I understand that you grew up in New York City on the Lower East Side. You had parents who immigrated here from Ecuador, and you later moved to the Bronx. I was curious about how your childhood in New York City and even the difference between living in those two different boroughs, how did that shape you?
It's a really interesting thing to have grown up in the Lower East Side and such a historically iconic immigration portal to the United States. I feel like I was really lucky and very much informed my perspective. I think inherently living in a place like that allowed for me to have a real appreciation for diversity from day one. The neighborhood was a very, very equitable mix of Jewish community, Chinese community, Latino community, and from my earliest memories, that was like the norm, which is pretty amazing, when I really think about it. So I was born in 1977, so my early consciousness was in the early 80s, and some of my earliest memories also allowed for me to witness really important cultural phenomena. I feel like I was able to observe the genesis or the environment that created hip hop and graffiti and other subcultures. There's also quite a big punk sort of alternative scene as well. And that was also extremely diverse. People like Africa Bambaataa were mixing ethnic music with craft work. And I think it really embodies that cultural convergence, So the witness to this cultural phenomenon, this appreciation of diversity, and also just kind of an acceptance or an appreciation of the speed of New York's evolutionary cycle. I know certain street corners as maybe under 8 different chapters. And I think that also really has informed my perspective as a gallerist.
You're really lucky to be able to be in the heart of all that while it was happening.
Yeah. I was really lucky, as was everyone else who was living there. And I formed a friendship over the years with many people who grew up in the Lower East Side. And it's really nice to talk about those days and that experience. It was definitely cool.
And was it a similar feeling with the Bronx? I imagine, especially musically, there was a lot going on at that point too.
I would say it was, in some ways, there was a lot of similarities, but it was also even more distinct than the Lower East Side because it was a little more dangerous at the time. And I don't think I understood that my family was poor when I was living in Manhattan. But when we moved to the Bronx when I was 10, I definitely realized we were poor, you know.
What prompted the move to the Bronx from the Lower East Side?
My parents moved to New York from farms in Ecuador in the late 60s, and they moved to Rivington Street. So they were basically in various tenement apartment buildings. So then they graduated to living in low income housing projects on Madison Street by the East River. What's famous about our housing projects was that Jerry Stiller grew up there as well back in the day. It was actually a really nice place to live, but I sort of equate it to prison without the cells because most people who live in low income housing are unfortunately kind of in an environment where it's hard to get out of that, you know? So there was an opportunity for my family to purchase a home in the South Bronx. And so that's what led us to go to the South Bronx.
During all this time, what was your interest in and exposure to art? Like, I mean, I totally get where you were living in the Lower East Side and then probably a lot of similar exposure in the Bronx, but did you have an active interest? Were your parents interested in art?
I didn't have like a specific interest, I don't think, but I had an awareness of it. It wasn't something that we had access to at home, and it wasn't something that I had access to at school either or in my neighborhood. But in the Lower East Side, you basically couldn't not see graffiti at the time. And one of my earliest memories was actually seeing a handball court mural by Lee Quinones, who a lot of people consider being the most iconic graffiti artist of New York, you know, along with Rammel-Z and Futura 2000 and Fab Five Freddy. So Lee grew up in the housing projects down the street from me, and he made a decision basically in 1982 to make a mural on a freestanding handball court wall called the Lion's Den. And it was because he felt the sadness about the fact that when he painted trains, they would just be this fleeting experience. They would just go away and disappear. So he decided, I want to respect my work enough where I put it in a place that it's not going to expire so quickly. And it was a real statement. And subsequently, Keith Haring, for sure, credited Lee with being an inspiration to him to make public murals and public work. And I also got to see Keith Haring chalkboard drawings in the subway, and he did a lot of murals on scaffolding. In my gym class on Pitt Street was at the Boys Club. There's still a mural that survives from the Boys Club that Keith Haring did. Even though the building was demolished, it was presented at Pioneer Works not so long ago. I got firsthand access to Keith Haring as a kid. And when we moved to the South Bronx, actually, I had another encounter where I saw this mural by John Ahern called Double Dutch. It's a relief sculpture on the side of the building with these kids playing jump rope. And it kind of blew me away. And for sure, these experiences when I was like 4, 8, 10 years old had a direct impact on my life and career and my perspective.
It sounds like such a vivid recollection. Yeah. And then to fast forward now, like, how did you end up going to Bard? What drew you there and what did you study there?
So I would say in high school, I really had an awakening to like music, and I was going to nightclubs all the time and going to places like the Palladium. And I got my first job at the Metropolitan Museum of Art.
Oh, that's cool.
I wasn't really like knowingly seeking this out, but clearly I was really like hungry for consuming art, be it visual art or music. Thankfully, it was very accessible in the city. Just take the train from the Bronx. It was like half an hour or 20 minutes into Manhattan. And the Met is such a wonderful resource to this day. I feel like it's such a gift to the city. For me, it felt like entirely accessible because it was a pay as you wish program. And so I could give them a penny and they wouldn't look down on that, you know?
Nobody looks at you when you give a penny. I noticed that there. They're very democratic and welcoming.
Which is really amazing. We don't have much outdoor space or public space in New York, but the Met, I luckily encountered that. I soaked it up. So I think like in my sort of like cultural awakening in high school, it became clear to me that the way to get out of the South Bronx, or of like the fact that I didn't have access to the art that I was starting to appreciate and love. I needed to find a school, like a college, that could fulfill that curiosity and interest. And that's how I found Bard College.
What did you study there? What were you focusing on?
I zigzagged between all these different things, but I graduated with a combination degree in anthropology and experimental film. And I was also loitering quite a bit at the Center for Curatorial Studies. So I think I got the idea of curating as a concept by spending time there.
You never considered being an artist, or did you take any art making classes?
I made films and videos, and I did a video artwork for my thesis. And on my thesis committee, Barbara S. was one of the committee members, and Leah Gilliam, a video artist, and Peggy Awesh, an experimental filmmaker. And I think the work that I ended up making impressed them enough for them to suggest that when I moved back to New York City, they said, James, you should look up the Public Art Fund and you should look up Creative Time, because I think that they do things that overlap with your interests right now in video art. And so I called Creative Time and asked them to exhibit my work. Thankfully, they didn't hang up the phone on me right away. And Pasternak then ended up becoming my first boss.
Oh, wow.
She's now running the Brooklyn Museum.
Right.
So that was my first job right out of school. So there was a lot of like coincidences leading to other opportunities, and just kind of fumbled my way into what was ultimately a career path.
That sounds serendipitous, though, connecting with Anne.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, Anne and Creative Time. That was amazing.
And what was next?
Well, I went back to the Met for a more secure job. So I became a security guard at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And two of the artists that I now represent, John McAllister and Jessica Dickinson, we were actually all guards at the Met at the same time.
That's so funny.
Yeah, and I just found a picture of myself in my security guard outfit and John McAllister in his security guard outfit.
Oh, that's amazing.
It is. But, back then it was like a nice, secure job with benefits. And then a friend at Creative Time actually had been living in the former Gavin Brown's enterprise, a 300 square foot storefront on Broome Street. So he had gotten into Harvard to go to the Graduate School of Design. And he was like, James, I know you're looking for an apartment. I jerry-rigged a shower in the back of the storefront that used to be an art gallery. Do you want to rent it?
Wow.
And back then, I was looking at all kinds of options. I was going to live on a tugboat. I was going to do this. I was going to do that. And renting a gallery / apartment sounded really cool.
Yeah.
So my very first version of an art gallery was many years before this more real version of the art gallery happened. It was down on Broome and Varick. And down there, I got to meet Gavin Brown, Jeffrey Deitch, Mitchell Algus, and Colin DeLand.
Wow.
It was a really tiny art world back then.
I imagine meeting Deitch was instrumental for you, because I know you eventually worked for him, but tell me about next steps and progression.
Next steps and progressions are like early 20s, and I was kind of finding my way. After September 11th, I curated a show immediately after September 11th. An artist who I co-curated the show with had borrowed some Basquiat works and then forged them and sold them. And it actually led to one of the first exhibitions I curated that received any attention, because once he was imprisoned for forging Basquiat, his name is Alfredo Martinez.
Oh yeah, I've heard of him.
Yeah. And so then he started sending me drawings from jail. And so I curated my first show with him called The United States of America versus Alfredo Martinez. And it's the first time people like Jerry Saltz came to see a show that I did.
It was at your own space?
It was after that space closed. And so like around the same time, I also met a community of galleries that were just starting to open, gallerists that were my age. Zach Foyer.
Oh, right. Okay.
Jane Haight and Janine Fowler, who had a space called Wall Space. Jane just founded a museum called Cara in the West Village. So around the same time, and this is kind of in between time in my early 20s, I met some really amazing peers that I would then kind of subsequently be able to build on, because I was kind of like flying in the dark completely on my own until then.
Before I jump into like your official life as a gallerist, can we talk a little bit about the reality TV show Art Star? What happened and how that played out?
So I had a background in filmmaking as well from Bard College, and I had met Jeffrey Deitch at an opening at Leo Koning's first gallery in Greenpoint. I really loved public access television at the time, and I felt that the Manhattan Neighborhood Network was the most underutilized resource in New York at the time because it's on every cable subscriber's television in New York, but it's all really kooky stuff on there, you know? And so I thought, wouldn't it be interesting to do something high production value for public access television? And so Jeffrey Deitch and I kind of came up with this idea of him hosting a show on public access television. This idea kind of sat for a while. And then I met this former MTV executive, Abby Turkuli, who I pitched the idea to. And then he suggested we take it to real networks. So we had meetings with everyone, like Andy Cohen at Bravo. We had meetings with HBO. And I remember thinking at the time, this is like 2003 or so. I'd been in New York my whole life, but I felt like I was in a play or a movie about a young person in New York trying to make his way, you know, when I was like trying to pitch this television show to people. We didn't get rejected by everyone. We got a development offer from HBO. And then what Abby explained to me is that in order to even get to pilot, you have to go through a development process first. So we could take this development deal with HBO, but there's a chance that it might not ever even go to pilot. And then even if it goes to pilot, it might not ever see the light of day as a series, you know? So then this burgeoning HD network called Gallery HD, which was on the Rainbow Media Network, approached us with $1 million budget for 8 episodes of television.
Wow.
Yeah. Which basically is maybe for 8 hours of television, it's a small budget because $1 million is like 30 minutes of television. He was like, look, it's a relatively small budget, but at least we will be able to do it. So we kind of took the shortcut there. And it was like early days for HD television. Now everyone has an HD TV. And it's crazy because it is a long time ago now. It broadcast in 2006.
Okay.
At the time, there was only 11 million HD television owners in the United States. So we made this reality TV show called Art Star, where Jeffrey Deitch is the front person, but nobody saw it.
Okay. I was going to say, does it live anywhere? Does it like still exist?
For a minute, you could get it on iTunes and stuff. I think it's circulating out there somewhere. There might be snippets of it on YouTube. It was a really interesting project. It made the cover of the art section of the New York Times. The Bruce High Quality Foundation actually formed in order for them to audition for the Art Star.
So much interesting art history here.
Yeah. Jenna Gribben also auditioned.
Was it a contest style format? Was that the idea? Kind of like Top Chef, but for art?
Basically.
Okay.
Yeah. It was weird. And it was far from the cool idea that we had for public access television. But the other sort of lesson that we learned is that by the time you introduce a concept into the entertainment industry, to television or film, you're lucky if you even recognize it by the time it actually gets produced and goes out into the world, you know, which is why artists like Jim Jarmusch and stuff who have like really intense creative control over their work, it's really worth its weight in gold. It's very rare. Reality was the genre at the time. We just kind of had to fit the mold of what people were interested in at the time.
Do you think that it might be easier to push through an idea nowadays because the art world is so much bigger? Or do you still think that kind of constraint of like how unique art is? I feel like it still exists in its own sort of silo, even as music and some other things get more mainstream. Like, do you think it would be any easier to do something like that nowadays?
I don't think it would be much easier because even before I got to the public access idea, I had really tried to research the intersection between art and television. I was obsessed with Nam June Paik. I was obsessed with Chris Bergen commercials from the 70s. And I learned about this German person named Jerry Schum, who created a program called TV Gallery in Germany. And the archive of this is at Electronics Arts Intermix. What he did was he convinced German television to give space to avant-garde artists like Joseph Beuys and Gilbert and George and stuff. I'm sure they were very special moments for a select few people who were like shocked and surprised and enjoyed seeing these high art moments on broadcast television. But I think it actually like was a complete failure. In fact, Jerry Schum committed suicide.
Oh, terrible.
So I don't know. I think like the stigma of television might still be too strong, but I do think we're in a new paradigm where selling out is not as lame of a concept
as it used
now
to be. Yeah.
as it maybe was.
Yeah. I'm going to pivot back to galleries now. And I realize all these things are intertwined.
Yeah.
So you worked at a number of different galleries before you started your own. Like, do you want to maybe reflect a little bit on those roles? Like what you learned from that, what you liked, didn't like?
Yeah. Earlier, I had my own space, but other than calling it a gallery, there was nothing holding it together that made it real. I didn't know what a press release was. I didn't sell art. I maybe sold one Jonas Mika's photograph. But after kind of floating around for a few years in my early 20s, I decided I wanted to professionalize myself when I was around 25. So I decided to seek gallery work to learn the trade. I worked for Lombard Freed Gallery as a director. They were exhibiting artists like Mark Bradford and Mark Handelman, who to this day is a dear friend, and shows with Sycamore Jenkins. Prior to that, I curated shows at Gavin Brown's enterprise, his Passerby project space. And then I worked for Jeffrey Deitch. I talked earlier about my interest in artists like Keith Haring. At the time, Jeffrey represented the Keith Haring estate, or at least did quite a bit of work with the Keith Haring estate. So for me, professionally, getting a chance to work with Jeffrey was a full circle moment where the ambience of cultural life and my upbringing kind of met my professional life in my mid-20s. So I would say that was extremely lucky for me to have that opportunity.
That's such an exciting sort of alignment. I'm thinking back of his program in the late 90s and like seeing Yoko Ono there and some of his other very groundbreaking shows. How long were you there in total?
Just for a couple of years, actually. But a couple of years before that, we were working on this television show. And we still very much stay in touch. We actually came to an opening that we did in Los Angeles a few weeks back for Elsa Renza. It's a nice rapport that we have and friendship that we continue.
Great. When did you start thinking about, okay, I want to maybe do something bigger and do something of my own?
Well, I wasn't sure I wanted to do anything after working for Jeffrey Deitch. I was in my late 20s and I had observed a lot of the field and had met so many gallerists. And I realized that this is really a career trajectory that doesn't get easier over time. I think I always imagined a career path where the longer I did something, the more I could kind of chill or take a back seat or something, or rely on seniority or experience. But our field is so ever changing that the prospect of having a long-term gallery project, especially because I had kind of crashed and burned with my first one, really terrified me. I knew how hard it was. So basically, I was like, maybe I need to go to business school. Maybe I need to find another career path. But I was wandering around downtown one day and saw a 2-story space for rent on a street called St. James Place. And the cross street was James Street.
Okay.
And it was this weird 2-story building with an apartment on the second floor and a storefront downstairs and a courtyard behind it. And I was like, I must be dreaming. This can't be real. Like, I was out of work, unsure with what to do with my life. And then this space presented itself. And my girlfriend at the time was working with Andrea Rosen. Her name is Branny Jones. And I called her while she was in Basel. And I was like, babe, I found this space. Like, it's going to be great. We're going to move in upstairs and I'm going to run the gallery downstairs. And she was like, go for it. I showed her how crummy the space was, and she was like, it's going to be fine. And then I was like, I promise you, we'll only have to live above the shop for 3 years. And it worked out that way. We only lived above the shop for 3 years, but the galleries never had a single investor. But I would say without the unwavering support of my girlfriend at the time, now wife and mother of my children, I don't know if I would have had the spine to jump in and do it.
Did you have a vision of what you wanted to do, or like what was even like your first thought for a show, or what was your first show?
Oh, yeah. I immediately envisioned the space being activated by shows. And one of our first shows, Got Snow, was picked up by Shamin Momin at the Whitney Museum, and she was immediately in the Whitney Biennial. And so we kind of right off the bat started accomplishing really serious things. I sold the majority of her show to Charles Saatchi. I was selling work to Dakis Joannou. My very first client was actually Anita Zabludovich. So I had, in my zigzag years, accumulated enough experience, knowledge, and a bit of a network to be able to accomplish some things like out of the starting gate. And it was great too because it was very low rent because we had this inexpensive lease. I opened in 2007, and 2008 was rough because of the recession at that time, but it was good that we were lean and mean at the time because it helped us get through that. And it was definitely a good lesson to learn early on.
Yeah. You mentioned like considering going to business school. It sounds like now that things were kind of taking off, you at least had some money and a cushion. So like, how much were you thinking about kind of like the business side of the gallery world?
In 2006, when I started thinking about the gallery, there was no art market anywhere near the level of what we're looking at now or functioning at now. So back then, it was still this kind of decision that if you were going to open a gallery, it was like becoming a monk, like take a vow of poverty. There really was no prospect of profit. I obviously wasn't thinking about profitability and creating a sound business. It was more of a heart and passion driven project in the beginning. But then when I finally moved out of this space on St. James Place, which was special, but it was also like kind of funky, I relocated to Delancey Street and I needed to do a build out. And I was like, maybe I need an investor. So I got my first kind of like business self-help book about how to write a business plan. But it's so funny because so many gallerists actually don't write their business plan before they open their galleries. I've talked to a lot of gallerists who've written it afterwards. But then in reading this book, it suggested that like if you're looking to find investors, the first place you should look to come up with some money is the bank, because the bank is going to expect less in return than an investor. So I got my first small business administration loan in 2010 to help for the build out of Delancey Street when we moved there. And basically ever since then, I've been on this like ongoing self-help journey to learn how to be a manager, learn how to read a balance sheet, all these things that I really did not have the skill or instinct for. I've kind of become very proactive at trying to figure this out because I realized that was an essential part of keeping things going. And then just before COVID, I was accepted to this program that Goldman Sachs does. It's kind of an immersive program for small business owners who already have existing businesses but want to kind of take it to the next level. It was a program started during the recession of 2008 because Goldman Sachs realized that small businesses are the backbone of the American economy. And so they wanted to create a program where they set up all these sort of high-level advisors to kind of do a crash course in scaling business to entrepreneurs. So I was enrolled in this program right before COVID. It's called Goldman Sachs 10,000 Small Businesses. We finished it remotely shortly after the summer of 2020. I would say that definitely gave me a little more scaffolding in terms of my ability to navigate a budget and think more analytically. I'm sure it changed the game for us
How has that shaped your philosophy, like on an ongoing basis? Like I mentioned in one of the earlier questions, I've always noticed that you have this very interesting mix of like some maybe older people that were perhaps didn't get their due during their lifetime or are still alive, and a mix of very buzzy names. Like I've seen a lot of your artists at the Whitney Biennial. How would you describe your philosophy? And I'm also curious about how this ongoing like self-education or participation in education and business helps shape your vision and your program.
I maybe credit Bard to this framework of appreciating knowledge from every source you can get it from. The structure for the classroom is like a seminar structure. So you're sitting around a table, there's open discussion, there's no hierarchy. And then out of school, teachers like Amy Silman were just at the bar. And it was like this very fluid intellectual exchange that I basically kind of carried over and applied to like everyday life in New York City, which is not as forgiving as
Yeah,
a liberal arts college environment.
for sure. Yeah.
But there were enough friends from Bard College in New York City where you could kind of create that sort of bubble and that atmosphere. So I think that I was eager to create an extremely inclusive program from day one, but I don't know how intentional it was, to be honest. It's just the way I was, like inherently because of also my upbringing. I grew up in a really diverse community. I'm first generation American myself. And so I think a lot of my openness to artists, which maybe felt radical to the New York art world 20 years ago, now it's like par for the course. Now it's like what everyone's striving for. And I'm so grateful to be living in this time where this is actually the case. I never thought I'd see the day.
Yeah, it's gratifying.
Yeah, it really is. The fact that museums are taking actual initiative to correct the disproportionately low rate of women artists in their collection. The fact that Oscar Yeho at 25 had a solo show at the Brooklyn Museum, a British Chinese artist that we work with who lives in Brooklyn. These are things that like just were not happening enough or at all when I started my career.
Yeah. So now you're like in the process of moving from Lower East Side to Tribeca. To look back for a second, I was thinking like you must have so much insight. You had like a front row seat to watching this neighborhood change, both with respect to your art gallery and just culturally and on a socioeconomic level. Like what has that been like and what are your thoughts on the changes?
It's changed a lot, the Lower East Side. Much of it remains exactly the same.
How so?
It's still a very large hub for immigration. Chinatown is so large. The housing projects haven't gone anywhere. Those are there forever. There's basically a stretch of a mile of housing projects along the East River between 14th Street and the South Street Seaport practically. So the Lower East Side still has managed to really retain the essence of what it always has been historically, since even like the iconic 19th century image of it, in my opinion.
Yeah.
I still see it. Everybody's like, oh, it's gone, it's gone. Although there's been this like kind of shift, the center of gravity for galleries is now Tribeca, but I still see a really thriving community in the Lower East Side, Henry Street being the epicenter of it now. And that's actually closer to where my first gallery was on St. James Place. It was like right around there with these flagship galleries like Miguel Abreu, who I have so much respect for, and 47 Canal and Emmanuel Periton. They're going to continue holding it down, Ramekin. So the Lower East Side has still really got it going on. It's just different. My moving to Tribeca really was a practical issue. My lease ends this year. And if somebody really did their analysis, like they could probably pinpoint the fact that gallery neighborhoods change every 10 years because that's basically how long leases last.
Oh, that's so interesting. Yeah. As part of that, and maybe before I jump totally to Tribeca and talk more about that, you were on Delancey Street for how long?
Since 2010, so 14 years.
Okay. I was curious also, like, I mean, I kind of talked about the broader scene, but over the years, we've seen so many of these kind of micro trends of like galleries like flocking in and then leaving, or like, going out to Long Island during the pandemic. You've witnessed so much. So I just wondered what you thought of this movement of like batches of galleries over the years.
I basically really thought I was going to move to Tribeca the minute Alexander and Bonin moved to Tribeca, which was 2016. I'm very friendly with Carolyn Alexander. So I went to see her space and I was like, I like this. She told me the rent they were paying. It was like this old school cast iron building. And I was like, wow, this has got a lot of potential. I had to work really hard to get people to St. James Place and James Street early on. That all I wanted for my next location is to be like on a recognizable street where everybody knows where it is. And I felt that if I had moved the gallery to Tribeca back then, I would have felt stranded again because there was only one gallery there. I think there were other moments, particularly during early COVID, Delancey Street and a lot of the neighborhood and the Bowery and the Lower East Side, largely because of Sarah D. Roosevelt Park, which is probably the most concentrated drug haven in New York City, and because mental health services were shut down. And for all these reasons, Delancey Street felt really apocalyptic at the time in 2020. So I started looking again to move around then. I looked in Chelsea, I looked again in Tribeca, but part of me still felt very kind of attached to my location on Delancey Street. I really intuitively felt like I still had more work to do in the Lower East Side. And I also felt a responsibility as a business owner on Delancey Street to not abandon the neighborhood, like not only like within my immediate community, but also for the sake of like my peer group, my neighbor gallery. So at that point, I was like, you know what? I'm just going to double down here. In fact, I asked my landlord if I could have another 20 years on my lease. I was basically like, maybe I'll just be like Russ and Daughters, where it's like, I'm just there forever. I'm just like sweeping the sidewalk until I'm an old man. I did have that idea, but then the expiration of my lease now is coming to a close. And it just felt like the right move, like 15 plus years in, it just seems like the right thing to mix it up a little bit.
Yeah.
Slightly bigger space in Tribeca. Also, for the first time in 17 years, to be centrally located in a real gallery district is exciting to me.
Yeah.
Like I think I owe it to my artists to finally put them front and center.
And you're opening on the 8th, is that correct? March 8th?
March 8th, big opening, grand opening.
What's the first show?
The first show is Kiko Saito. He moved to New York from Tokyo in the late 60s, and he set up his studio on Chambers Street, just a few blocks away. Generally, in our overall program, in these instances where we work with historically important artists, is that we're trying to renovate or recalibrate the historical narrative. So it's just one of these amazing artists that I think people are going to really enjoy and have a lot to learn from.
Yeah, it's a nice kind of like confluence of events, like your history, his history, the new space. It sounds very exciting.
Yeah.
And also, I want to talk a little bit about where Los Angeles fits into your broader picture. I haven't seen your new space yet, but hopefully I will. Tell me about Los Angeles and the sort of like art world ecosystem and in your bigger picture.
The idea came about during early COVID times. My wife now works at David Zwerner Gallery, and I learned about this neighborhood that the gallery was going to open a branch in Los Angeles. And when I visited, like in early 2021, I got to meet this young guy who's developing the neighborhood that the gallery was going to be in. His name is Zach Lazary, and I really was blown away by his idea or vision of what he wanted to do in the neighborhood, because a lot of the buildings were kind of expiring furniture showrooms, and he wanted to create this little district that was an ecosystem of businesses like galleries, retail, restaurants, bars, a hotel, just so that like if you go to an opening at a gallery, you can actually walk down the street and go to the after party. You don't have to get into your car. He had come from New York to Los Angeles to act and experience in Hollywood, but he kind of had this like New Yorker sensibility. He saw this potential in this neighborhood. And so the idea of opening a gallery there kind of started percolating then. And then I would go back frequently to visit, and I'd run into Al Moran from Moran, who has a gallery in the neighborhood. And at one point he was like, James, man, stop kicking the tires, man. Just like, just sign a lease already,
Take the plunge. Yeah.
And yeah, take the plunge. And it was nice because actually in that instance, I realized like I actually have a community out here. It's not such a crazy thing. It just felt like the right thing to do for the gallery at that point. About 15 years in, there were artists signing up with galleries that I wasn't crazy about. And this kind of protected the strategy that we were developing with the artists in terms of their career path and what we wanted to do. So there was that thinking. There was like this access and conversation with the LA community of artists as well, which is compelling. There was like this beautiful space that I found that actually has nothing to do with Zach's project, but is within the neighborhood.
Is that what they're calling Melrose Hill?
Yeah, they're calling the neighborhood Melrose Hill because there's a really beautiful residential neighborhood called Melrose Hill, like a few blocks away. And so I fell in love with this space basically on Melrose that was triple the size of my space on Delancey Street, but it was about the same rent.
Yeah, I hear this from a lot of dealers about how much more you get for your money out there.
Yeah. And then my artists started looking at pictures I was showing them of the space, and they were like, you should go for it. There was a lot of reasons, and knowing I wouldn't be isolated in that neighborhood too, because we've got my good friends around the corner. We got Shrine, we've got Clearing, great galleries from LA like Chateau are opening. Emma Fernberger, who's a Bard alumni. Then David Zwerner, the flagship. The anchor for me is the fact that like early on, LAX Art signed on to buy and create their space in that neighborhood too. So they're going to be opening soon as well. So it's an exciting thing. I sometimes tell people like it's like the perfect thing to complicate my project at this time because it allows for a reset in a way. Like I had the same feeling going into this gallery in LA that I had in 2006 when I found this space on St. James Place. It's like this new adventure. So like what a nice opportunity to have.
That's awesome to hear. I figured it would be a good time to ask you, like with Frieze Week on us, like what's your view of art fairs? What's your strategy in terms of how do you decide how many to do a year and how do you make choices about which ones?
I try to stay close to the reliably successful fairs for us. Mm-hmm. Which kind of change a little bit from year to year, like which location works for us. But Art Basel, the Independent, Frieze, there's just like a very consistent quality in those fairs that basically almost always works for us. Like it's almost always like for sure going to be productive and not risky. And we're doing the Dallas Invitational, this like boutique fair in Dallas that James Cope is running. So that's going to be like more of a fun project to bring some interesting artists to Dallas. I'm a member of the ADAA. And so whenever we have the right project for that fair context, we also love doing the ADAA fair at the Park Avenue Armory. So yeah, basically like after my first Art Basel, we did a statements project in Switzerland with Amalia Ullman. It was a very production heavy statement and we had fabricators involved and all this stuff. And we basically didn't sell anything at the fair. And it was the end of June. And I remember Cal and Alexander warning me about this. She was like, James, be careful, like, because these are really big bills to pay at the end of June, right before summer, and summer's slow. And if it doesn't work, it can really mess you up. So I came back from Basel, having not sold anything, being really proud of the project that we did. Amalia is a genius. We did this project and it didn't work. And I always thought like by the time I got to Art Basel in Switzerland, I was just going to be cashing checks. I really thought I'd made it, but then that fair actually ended up doing the opposite. It really kicked my ass. So after that experience, which was around 2016, I decided not to do art fairs for a solid year or 2 years because I realized that I needed to get my infrastructure together a little bit more, be more prepared, and not jump into the fairs so intuitively and emotionally. Like I needed to be more practical about them. So that was an important lesson. I think that The fairs are important, but the way the fairs go, that all the center of gravity, like a couple of years ago, it really was Freeze LA.
Yeah.
And then last year, the center of gravity was Seoul in Korea. This year, it was Mexico City. I don't know if any other fair this year is going to have the heat or thunder.
Oh, wow. Interesting.
From what I've heard, at least as far as like FOMO is concerned,
Yeah.
like I wish I'd gone.
Okay.
I think the hot points are always going to move, for fairs, and like in terms of like the magic and like the productivity and all of these things. But ultimately, it just makes sense to do what's right for the business, and it's different for everybody.
Yeah, that is interesting that it's such a shift, because I guess I always think of like, oh, Freeze LA is still really hot. But then again, I'm not a dealer, so there's probably a lot that I'm not seeing.
Yeah, I'm sure it's really hot. But then Mexico City just kind of, I think a lot of people had gone there who had never gone there before. So there's just kind of this critical mass that happens, and like all this offsite programming. And also now there's this like really nice exchange between Mexico City and LA as well. In a way, Mexico City's success probably had a lot to do with the success of Freeze Los Angeles when you actually really think about it. For us, like Freeze LA feels totally mandatory now because we have a space in LA, and it's such a wonderful program. And yes, they've created this like undeniable center of gravity in Los Angeles. I wonder if this influx of galleries would have happened without it.
Yeah,
Probably
that's an interesting point.
Not. It's amazing what impact fairs can have.
Yeah, it does feel like there's so much energy on the LA scene right now. Well, James, thank you so much for all your time, and congratulations on the Tribeca space. We're excited to see what you do there and elsewhere in your galleries. So thank you again.
Thank you so much, Eileen, and thank you for hearing me out. I hope I didn't talk your ear off.
No, it was great. We enjoyed it. That's it for this week's episode. If you like what you heard, you can subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever else you get your podcasts. Also, take a moment to rate and review us. It will help other listeners discover what we're doing. The Art Angle is produced by Sonia Manalili and Caroline Goldstein. Thanks for listening, and see you next week.